Let me introduce today's speaker. Hi, everybody. I'm Frey. Welcome to 19B. Today's speaker is Emily Frey, who comes to us from the Brandeis University Department of Music. And Emily's paper is called Acting Ukrainian, the case of Osip Petrov. And as SOBESEDNIK, we are glad to welcome Grace Mahoney from the University of Michigan. So please, Emily, take it away. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, and first off, I wanted to say thank you so much for this invitation. I was mentioning just before we started that the scariest thing about doing interdisciplinary work is also the most worthwhile thing, and that is, as a musicologist, sharing my work with people who know a lot more about certain parts of it than I do. This paper that I'm about to read represents a new direction for me and kind of my post-2022 direction, as I'll tell you about in just a little bit. It's my first time really attempting to deal with Ukraine in a meaningful way, and also probably my second time attempting to deal with theater, opera and theater, in a meaningful way instead of opera and literature, which was the focus of my dissertation. And so I really welcome the feedback from this group, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So thank you all. All right. As a scholar of the 19th century, writing about people long dead, I have been little accustomed to thinking about what and whose modern-day ends my work might serve. I have at times described my own work as offering an alternative to the dogged focus on nationalism that I thought had plagued the field of Russian music studies for too long. In 2014, a few weeks before Russian troops invaded the Crimean Peninsula, I complained in the introduction to my dissertation that I was tired of the subject of Russian nationalism in music. Without diminishing the historical significance that nationalist ideas have had in Russia, I wrote, one nevertheless wonders how much of the stage has been left unilluminated by so bright and sharp a spotlight on this one area. It is a bit painful to read these words now, painful to remember that I once thought it was possible, even desirable, to simply change the subject, to talk about Russian music in a way that avoided questions of nation and empire. For today, Putin justifies the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the grounds of cultural history. In a long 2021 essay, Putin declared that only Russian culture has history, not Ukrainian. His claim to cultural hegemony is staked in large part on the repertoire I have devoted half my life to studying, the 19th century Russian classics. Writing a cultural history of this time period, of these works, is now fraught in a way I could never have imagined as a graduate student. And on the slide here is a picture of the Kremlin Orchestra performing Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, a work I've written about many times, in the ruins of the Mariupol Drama Theater in 2022. And so, что делать? I have often thought over the past 3.5 years that maybe I just shouldn't write about Tchaikovsky or Mussorgsky now. I haven't been alone in that conclusion. I remember some real hand-wringing on the Sea Lang's listserv over Dostoevsky in 2022. How can we teach him now, knowing that he might have supported this war? Is there any ethical way to practice our expertise in these times? Such crises of faith are familiar to Russian artists and to those who study them, but of course they do not always mesh well with the exigencies of graduate student funding or the tenure clock. Since the beginning of Putin's full-scale invasion, writing about 19th century music in the Russian Empire has often seemed to me a hopeless moral morass. But in an address at Harvard last year, Ukrainian First Lady Olena Zelenska offered a counter-argument. Accusing Russia of, quote, gobbling up generations of Ukrainian artists, Zelenska exhorted scholars in the humanities to reevaluate the cultural products of the Russian Empire, washing away the empire's myths, she said, from monuments of ostensibly Russian genius. I confess I find it hard to feel quite so optimistic as the First Lady about scholarship, at least my own scholarship, constituting a meaningful political intervention in this strafny vek. But the ruptures of the present have a way of unsettling the past. rendering visible themes and connections that have long been obscured from view. And as it happens, I'd like to turn now to an opera that has more imperial myths associated with it than perhaps any other, Glinka's A Life for the Tsar, and explore the contributions of one gobbled-up Ukrainian artist, the prolific bass, Osip Petrov. Strange things are afoot in the Russian woods. In Act 4 of A Life for the Tsar, the Russian peasant Ivan Susanin has led the Polish army into an impenetrable forest where a deadly blizzard is imminent. The Poles have begun to suspect that they may not, in fact, make it to Moscow in time to stop the coronation of Mikhail Romanov. Western rationalists that they are, the Poles act upon these life or death suspicions by taking a quick nap. Equally logically, Ivan Susanin responds to the sudden incapacitation of his enemies by neither escaping to safety nor attempting to kill them. Instead, he sings. Chuyut pravdu, he sings of the Poles. They sniff the truth. He reckons with his own certain death in an aria that sounds like humble Russian song, a resemblance not lost on the opera's earliest critics. Almost all of them commented on the fact that Glinka had not restricted Russian melody to rustic comedy or to scattered bits of local color provided by the chorus. Here in the snowy woods, Ivan Susanin still sounds like a Russian peasant to an opera-going St. Petersburg audience anyway, even while behaving like a tragic hero. It was this moment to which Prince Adoyevsky was referring in the comment everyone repeats about A Life for the Tsar, that Glinka's achievement lay in raising Russian melody to the heights of tragedy. I'm going to play for you a 1 or 2 minute excerpt from this aria just so you can hear this. Here we go. So this comes from the forest scene of A Life for the Tsar, and the little Russian song that Ivan Susanin sings here. Sorry. Okay, so after about 4 minutes, the Russian song is finished, but Susanin is not. He holds the stage alone for another 8 minutes or so, interspersing memories of his children with grim forebodings of his bones lying untraceable in the forest. Formally, this second section of Susanin's Scene in the Woods is much freer than the little song, a simple ABA form with coda, that preceded it. Susanin delivers his recitative at times a cappella, at times with so-called secco punctuation from the orchestra. This term, secco punctuation, refers to short staccato chords that are separated by rests. And at times in a more lyrical arioso style, accompanied by reminiscence motifs in the orchestra. Just as a little explainer, in opera, a reminiscence motif is a brief musical theme that's associated with a certain character or event that's appeared earlier in the opera. So these themes help to create kind of oral connections between present and past, and often, as in A Life for the Tsar, they allow the audience to follow the train of a character's thought without words. So I'm going to play you a 2-minute excerpt from this section, the Shena following the scene following the Russian song. About 30 seconds in, you're going to hear an upbeat melody in the flutes. This is a reminiscence motif taken from the aria of Susanin's daughter, Antonida. And before he mentions her name, the melody tells us that he is thinking of her. So here we go.
Очутился далече от глуши непроходных лесов и снегов, во тьме непроглядной, во власти врагов. Мою дитятку Антонидушка, ты чуяла гибель мою, с рыданием меня отпустила. Не заметет метель твой след, дочерний след к родимой хате, к моим костям и следу нет.
Okay, I'll stop it there, but you can hear this is stylistically very, very different from the earlier excerpt, which was much more like a song. This is much more like speech and very stylistically diverse. Taken as a unit, Susanin's forest scene has served as a flashpoint for discussions of a life for the Tatar's national identity. Glinka himself contributed to this conversation in his memoirs, writing that, quote, "The scene in the forest imprinted itself deeply in my imagination. I found much in it that was original, much that was characteristically Russian." Over the years, Russian and Anglophone writers have found the forest scene structure freewheeling and sui generis, arguing that here, at the opera's dramatic crux, Glinka shakes off all dependence on Italian formal procedures. More recently, however, Rutger Helmers and Daniil Zablunov have pointed out the forest scene's ancestry in the Italian double aria form, also known as la solita forma or the Code Rossini. Both Helmers and Zablunov note affinities between the forest scenes and certain mad scenes from bel canto operas such as Bellini's La Sonnambula, an opera that apparently impressed Glinka to the point of tears during his time in Milan in the spring of 1831. All right, so the Code Rossini itself may require a bit of, well, decoding. The term was coined by the musicologist Julian Budden, who described a set of formal methods common to early 19th century Italian operas. These conventions enabled the extraordinary productivity of composers such as Bellini, Donizetti, and above all Rossini, who was the codifier, if not the inventor, of these procedures, by channeling music and drama into a defined yet flexible form. Arias, ensembles, and full scenes alike could adhere to a basic four-part formula, and it is reference to this formula that nationalist commentators usually have in mind when they deride the Italianism of this or that Russian opera. Here is what the form looks like. So first we have the Scena, that's the first movement. It'll be composed in recitative, so kind of similar to what we just heard at the end of Susanin's aria. This is a part of this scene that will drive the plot forward, setting up some sort of situation that's going to require an emotional reflection, a lyrical pause. Next up comes the cantabile. This is that lyrical moment, that lyrical pause, an emotional moment conveyed in song-like music at a slow or moderate tempo, typically in a highly structured form, often with beautiful melodies. So if you remember Oblomov, Costa Diva, which plays such an important role in the courtship between Olga and Oblomov, is an example of a cantabile, beautiful melodies. Next, we have the tempo di mezzo, which is a sudden change that is usually prompted by either the announcement of some new information or the arrival of a new character. It's also going to be in recitative, so speech-like rather than song-like. The point of the tempo di mezzo is to motivate an emotional change. And that the outcome of that will be reflected in the cabaletta, which is another song-like movement. It will have, again, a tight, repetitive structure and a singable melody, singable if you're an opera singer, because this is where you're going to have vocal fireworks, a lot of coloratura, very showy and brilliant. So that's the basic four-part structure we're talking about here. The Code Rossini, then, preserved the traditional parceling out of operatic text into action, the scena and the tempo di mezzo, captured musically in recitative, and emotion, so the cantabile and the cabaletta, captured in song. Generally speaking, the most important parts of the Code Rossini were the emotional sections, the slow and gorgeous cantabile and the show-stopping cabaletta. This musical contrast is easy to hear, and it helped to orient listeners' ears during long stretches of music. In the case of a mad scene, a prolific category in early 19th century Italian opera, the form and function of the Code Rossini were likely to be artfully disheveled. For example, the first movement, the scena of a mad scene, might be especially long and musically mercurial, with the central character inappropriately narrating her inner feelings in recitative rather than song. But even in a mad scene, the four basic movements of the Code Rossini, and in particular the slow, fast pairing of cantabile and cabaletta, were usually recognizable. I find the debts of Susanin's forest aria to bel canto mad scenes to be incontestable. On stage, the forest scene even looks, from A Life for the Tsar, even looks like an Italian mad scene, which has a characteristic fermata shape. You have the raving protagonist at center stage, and the spectating, or in this case, sleeping peanut gallery arrayed behind in an arc. As an aside, when I read Dostoevsky, I very often think of his scandal scenes as having this same exact sort of visual shape, where we have, the protagonist in the middle, and then the nosy and noisy peanut gallery around the frame. Very bel canto of him. A stylistically rangy recitative peppered with reminiscence themes is also par for the mad scene course, as Rutger Helmers points out. This rhapsodic structure is meant to capture rapid shifts of consciousness. Rather than lingering on one emotion, as a sane protagonist might do in the cantabile and cabaletta of a conventional aria, a mad character singing a scena will flit from thought to thought, from feeling to feeling, from present to past and back again, just as Susanin does here in the forest scene. But in other ways, Glinka ignores or even overturns mad scene conventions. The movements of the Code Rossini are in the wrong order. While a mad Italian might sing a scena as kaleidoscopic as Susanin's, that formal chaos will eventually coalesce into a cantabile slow movement and then a brilliant cabaletta. Susanin, however, inverts the usual order of things, giving us not the typical scena ed aria, but rather aria e scena. Formally speaking, Susanin's utterances do not coalesce, but rather dissolve. No brilliant finale follows the anguished and unstable scena. Having bid farewell to his children in recitative, Susanin simply nods off, leaving the orchestra to narrate a snowstorm. What we have then is the upside-down torso of a mad scene, with all the weight shifted to the rambling scena, which dwarfs Susanin's cantabile in both dramatic heft and in sheer length. And so for me, the compelling question is not so much, is the forest scene Russian or Italian? As always with The Life for the Tsar, the answer is probably just yes. I wonder, rather, why refer to the conventions of the bel canto aria, of the bel canto mad scene in this way, at this moment, for this character? For Ivan Susanin, of course, isn't mad. However extreme his emotional state on the point of death, Susanin remains clear-headed enough to carry out his martyr's duty without a hitch. One might expect, then, that the lyrical, Russian romance-inflected cantabile might have been enough on its own to deal with the dramatic stakes of this scene. It would have given Susanin a dignified, moving, and entirely appropriate send-off, while providing satisfying musical closure. Why, after the cantabile ends, does Glinka then follow the progressive peregrinations of Susanin's mind in an 8-minute musical ramble? My suspicion is that the answer may have less to do with considerations of national identity than with considerations of performance. From the very beginning of his work on the opera, Glinka conceptualized the various roles in A Life for the Tsar with specific performers in mind. His initial plan for the opera, written sometime in the winter of 1834 to 35, contains both a sketch of the plot and a list of the dramatis personae, with each character's name listed next to that of the singer who would portray the role. And Osip Petrov, there he is, Osip Petrov, the young bass for whom Glinka conceived the role of Ivan Susanin, had already earned a reputation in St. Petersburg for his nuanced and powerful acting. Indeed, Glinka refers to him as Petrov, acteur, rather than bass, in his memoirs. In 1835, Petrov had made a star turn in Meyerbeer's opera Robert le Diable as Bertram, a role that, like Ivan Susanin, demands the portrayal of unusually complex feelings for an operatic character, along with quick changes of mood. It is not inconceivable, then, I think, that Glinka may have hoped for a similar coup de théâtre in the forest scene of A Life for the Tsar. How better to achieve that than to invert the usual order of the Code Rossini, highlighting Petrov's virtuosic acting skills in a dynamic and wide-ranging scena? What if Glinka's formal choices here in the forest scene were less about the national implications of different musical styles and more about creating sensational theater by harnessing the peculiar talents of his popular bass? Whatever Glinka intended, a coup de théâtre was precisely what Osip Petrov achieved. He went on to sing Ivan Susanin for some 30 years thereafter as the season opener for the Russian troupe, amounting to just under 300 performances of the role. Critics who could agree on little else all saw in Petrov the ideal embodiment of Glinka's heroic peasant. Quote, "In the role of Susanin, Petrov created an eternal type," raved the conservative critic Rostislav. In the opinion of the more progressive Mussorgsky a few decades later, quote, "The appearance of Dedushka Petrov," he called Petrov Dedushka, grandfather, as Susanin is the appearance of Susanin, the idea, in Petrov. Alexander Serov, who was improbably an aesthetic opponent of both Rostislav and Mussorgsky, wrote in his journal Music and Theater, quote, "Anyone who undertakes to play Susanin needs to more or less copy Petrov, unless he wants to remake the entire role independent of the author." Understanding these reactions requires a little attention to the infant stages of Russian operatic criticism in the 1820s and 1830s, especially as it attached to performance. Among the Russian troops, two singers in particular came to serve as anchors for a host of issues that Russian music critics were working through at this time. Osip Petrov was one, and the contralto Anna Vorobyova, who actually married Petrov in 1837, was the other. While scholarship on 19th century Russian singers remains scant, the husband and wife team of Petrov and Vorobyova has featured prominently in several recent writings. Juliet Forshaw's article in Cambridge Opera Journal traces the careers of these two singers, among several others. In The New Grove, Lakin Simons writes about the ways in which Vorobyova's reception got caught up in the emerging discourse of nationalism, with critics emphasizing Russian depth of feeling over Italian brilliance. My interest here lies in the ways in which Russian music critics picked up on a distinction developing in contemporary theatrical criticism, relating to two different types of actors. On the one hand, there were the chameleons, those actors who were seemingly able to efface themselves, to dissolve into the various and diverse roles they portrayed, such that audiences only saw the characters, or better yet, the real-life social types those characters represented, not the performers. On the other hand, were the actors I might call the divas, whose passionate sincerity, in Viktor Borovsky's words, quote, "whose missionary and prophetic zeal burned with fiery brilliance in the theater. These were artists who played only one tune, but that the most enthralling," end of quote. This typology of actors maps quite well onto the ways in which 19th century music writers accounted for the operatic performances of Petrov and Vorobyova. Petrov was clearly identified as a protean performer, a creator of many incomparable types, in the 1868 words of one anonymous critic, and this is the full quotation here. Russian writers on opera tended to describe Petrov's voice and his singing with a rather conspicuous infrequency, commenting more often on his precise declamation and his sensitive acting. So here we have one. And then this is Mussorgsky's quotation, the appearance of grandfather Petrov as Susannin is, in my opinion, the appearance of Susannin, the idea as Petrov. Here we have one from a very early performance of Petrov from 1833. Mr. Petrov played his role more precisely than anyone else and uncommonly well. How marvelous, one involuntarily extols him. Here is truth. Here is acting. Here is singing with feeling. And a few more. This is from César Frey in the 1860s. What is there to say about Mr. Petrov? How can one capture all the subtlety and nuance of his acting, his truthfulness of expression to the finest gradations, his exceptionally intelligent singing? And Laroche, as usual, Petrov spoke his part more than he sang it, which in Rimsky-Korsakov's Pskovetyanka, with a constant recitative, was almost no shortcoming. And his declamation and acting also as usual, were full of life, truth, and characteristicness. I'm pulling out these two quotes in particular because Cui and Laroche agreed on absolutely nothing other than apparently Osip Petrov. And finally, my favorite one here from Petrov's debut in St. Petersburg. Quote, his face is pleasant enough, but all too little trained. But already in the role of Sarastro, we noticed his quite correct diction. Even in his gestures, he acted with both hands, unlike Mr. Shuvalov, who made almost every gesture with his right hand alone. At the beginning of the second act of The Magic Flute, Petrov expressed Sarastro's monologue successfully and sang his difficult aria. All right, so to pull out just a few themes that are fairly consistent in Petrov's critical reception across a long span of time. We have a diversity of roles and types. We have the merging of actor with role and even the sublimation of the performer to the character, the emphases on speech, diction, declamation, and also subtlety, nuance, fine details, the abundance of terms meaning truth, pravda, vernost, istinnost, and life, живой and жизненный, already in criticism in the 1830s and continuing on until the 1870s. If, for Russian critics, Petrov was a singing chameleon, Vorobyova's critical image more closely matched the other type, the diva. In Russian criticism, Vorobyova is always figured as a commanding sonic and theatrical presence, her performances burning with such qualities as sincerity, purity, ardor, and passion. And here's a sampling of these reviews of Vorobyova's recital performances from around the time of A Life for the Tsar. These all appeared in Ruski Invalid, which was a St. Petersburg daily newspaper. And the third quotation is from the Soviet musicologist Abram Gozanpud, summarizing Vorobyova's critical reception in the 1830s. So Vorobyova was received with incomparable enthusiasm as usual. However, several listeners remarked how Vorobyova surpassed even herself in music that demanded sincerity and fervor. Concerning Vorobyova, her singing, which is always dramatic and moving, was even more powerful this time. During the orphan song, one listener exclaimed, "I threatened to cry with every sound." This is quite common in reviews of Vorobyova, this idea of tears being evoked by her voice. Then here's Gozanpud's summary. In her talent, there was such sincerity, purity, and ardor. The image of Vanya, burning with purity and tenderness, in Vorobyova's portrayal was as new a phenomenon in the Russian theater as was Petrov's Susannin. So in contrast to the case of her husband, it was Vorobyova's voice that attracted the bulk of critical attention. And many a writer summoned the most luxuriant adjectives in the Russian lexicon to capture the sonic thrill of her full, round, velvety contralto. Quite characteristically for 19th century writings about European divas, Vorobyova was very often positioned in comparison with other female singers. Her voice and stage presence compared favorably with Judita Pastas, Pauline Viardot's, or even anachronistically Adelina Patti. Petrov, the refined, subtle chameleon, Vorobyova, the diva burning with passionate sincerity, this tale of two singers seems to me one way to link the history of Russian opera with the history of Russian dramatic performance more broadly, a task I have long thought to be desperately in need of doing. In Russian theater, the middle of the 19th century saw the ascendancy of the chameleons. The theater historian Anatoly Altshuler has described the ways in which the romantic actors of the 1820s and 1830s, performers such as Pavel Motolov and Vasily Karatigin, who excelled as, quote, regicides, avengers, and rebels, full of vitality and energy, were eclipsed by earthier character actors later in the 1830s. Born a serf in 1788, Mikhail Shchepkin would become the most celebrated actor of the 19th century within the Russian Empire. For critics, the protean performer par excellence, Shchepkin spoke of his methods in entirely self-effacing terms, writing in 1848 that, quote, an actor of feeling begins by wiping out his own self. Renowned for his blend of comedy and pathos in such roles as the mayor in Revizor, Shchepkin is now credited in virtually every encyclopedia with having, quote, introduced realistic acting into Russian drama. This phrasing comes from the Oxford Companion to Theater and Performance, but you can find variants of it on sources ranging from the official website at the Mali Theater, where Shchepkin spent most of his career, or worked for decades at least, to Wikipedia. The link between Shchepkin's particular approach to performance and some concept of realism, or at least realisticness, originates not in encyclopedias, of course, but in the theater criticism of Belinsky, Herzen, and many other writers of the 1830s and 1840s. Quote, he created truth on the Russian stage. He was the first to be untheatrical in the theater, wrote Herzen in his obituary of Shchepkin. Russian opera offers in many ways a parallel story. Anna Voryova, the burning diva, burned out. Her retirement in 1845 at the age of 28 is variously attributed to motherhood and to the loss of her one-of-a-kind voice, perhaps because the leadership of the imperial theaters forced the contralto to sing baritone roles. Osip Petrov, hailed, like Shchepkin, for his nuanced acting and true-to-life depiction of Russian social types, went on to have a 52-year stage career. He created, by my count, 12 leading or supporting roles in Russian operas premiering between 1836 and 1876, which may not sound like a lot, but this represents the vast, vast majority of Russian language operas first performed in St. Petersburg during this time. There were several operas that premiered in Moscow and elsewhere, and one or two St. Petersburg premieres in which he did not participate, such as Twee's William Radcliffe of 1869. But this is upwards of 80% of Petersburg premieres across 40 years. Keep in mind, too, that as with A Life for the Tsar, many of these operas became repertory items, and so Petrov sang some of these roles over and over and over again for many years. To my knowledge, this is a situation unique in the history of European opera, not simply because of Osip Petrov's staying power. Google tells me there's a 19th century French singer who beat Petrov by a couple of decades, but also because of his ubiquity. Several musicians left statements declaring it impossible to imagine anyone else in the roles for which Petrov was known. I've already quoted Serov above, saying that, quote, anyone who undertakes to play Susanna needs to more or less copy Petrov. And this incredible consistency on the level of performance, with Osip Petrov leading the Russian troupe for decades, offers something of a corrective to the prevailing view on Russian opera during this period. We're long accustomed to imagining the history of 19th century Russian music as a story of implacable rivalries, nationalists versus cosmopolitans, conservatory-trained professionals versus amateur autodidacts. But if, between the late 1820s and the late 1870s, you went to see an opera by Glinka, Rubinstein, Dargomyshky, Serov, Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, or Tchaikovsky, you were likely to see Osip Petrov in a leading role. For 19th century audiences, Russian opera looked and sounded like Osip Petrov, regardless of who wrote the notes. Moreover, composers of diverse aesthetic persuasions tended to write for Osip Petrov in similar ways. A long, psychologically complex solo for bass, in a rangy form more akin to a dramatic monologue than an aria, is a hallmark of many Petrov roles, not just Ivan Susanin. I'll point especially to the Miller in Dargomyshky's Rusalka and to Ivan the Terrible in Rimsky-Korsakov's Pskovityanka. We could also think of Boris Godunov's monologues as belonging to the same sort of Petrovian stylistic family. even though Petrov was much too old to handle a role that large in 1876. And these Petrovian musical monologues have often been loci classici for analysts in search of Russian musical realism from 19th century to the present. Modest Mussorgsky, the paradigmatic realist in any music appreciation textbook, openly acknowledged Petrov's influence on his own work, calling the bass, quote, a titan who carried on his Homeric shoulders almost everything created in dramatic music since the 1830s, end of quote. It was with good reason that, at Osip Petrov's lavish 50-year anniversary celebration at the Mariinsky Theater, the music critic Vladimir Sasov declared Petrov to be, quote, one of the founders of the Russian operatic tradition. This was how I had long thought my book on opera and realism in 19th century Russia would begin, with an argument that realism wasn't just something composers did, that in the 1830s, decades before Mussorgsky began jotting down speech rhythms, performers like Osip Petrov and Mikhail Shipkin were fussing over the accuracy of their declamation, were recognized by audiences as having successfully embodied real-life social types, were associated with a performance style that emphasized fine details and precise observations. But after February 24th, 2022, one element of Petrov's career seemed to scream for attention. The other leading singers in A Life for the Tsar, the soprano Maria Stepanova, the tenor Lev Leonov, and the contralto Anna Vorobyova, were native Petersburgers, educated at the Imperial Theater School. Vorobyova actually originally trained as a ballerina, and only later did she switch to opera. Osip Petrov, originally Josip, was born in Yelisavetgrad, Ukraine. And I realize that I probably don't need to do this for this particular audience, but here is a map just so you can have a sense of the region we're talking about here. Yelisavetgrad, so I've circled Petrov's birthplace, which is now called Kropyvnytsky in red. So this was a trading town in central Ukraine, and that's probably why Petrov's family lived there, because they were merchants. On the right is a graphic from the Washington Post showing when Russia annexed Ukrainian territory from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The land on which Yelisavetgrad was built was acquired in 1739. When Osip Petrov was born, about 65 years later, there was still a large Polish population in the area, as well as ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians, and of course, this area being within the Pale of Settlement, also Jews. So no one ethnic group had a majority in Yelisavetgrad. There is some disagreement in the Russian sources on the year of Petrov's birth, which is variously given in 1805, 1806, or 1807, and Petrov himself seems to have been a little confused on that score. But two sources from his hometown both place his birth in November 1805, so I'm going to use that. These two sources are a biography of Petrov's early years written by a family neighbor and a birth record from a church next to the Petrov's house showing an infant, Osip, born illegitimately to a woman named Yevdokia, which we know was Osip Petrov's mother's name. This little snippet here comes from the Simonovsky Museum of Musical Culture in Kropyvnytsky. So unlike his co-stars in the Russian opera troupe, Petrov did not have formal training as a performer. When a traveling theater troupe came to Yelisavetgrad, and more importantly to his uncle's tavern, where 20-year-old Yonka worked, he asked to join them. The first 4 of Osip Petrov's 52 years on stage were spent as a repertory player in 2 Ukrainian theater troupes. The first led by a certain Zhurokovsky, the second by the Kharkiv impresario Stein. Within these troupes, Petrov performed in towns throughout central, southern, and eastern Ukraine, including Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and Poltava. In Russian and Soviet biographies, Osip Petrov's Yelisavetgrad origins are often summoned, predictably enough, to support the image of a simple man of the folk who hailed from a provincial backwater. From there, Ukraine tends to evanesce from Petrov's biography, as if becoming a great Russian base meant leaving Little Russia behind for good. But this notion does not square with other details of Petrov's post-Poltava existence. Throughout his life, Petrov socialized with a group of Ukrainian artists and intellectuals who recognized each other's shared national origins, Taras Shevchenko and the actor Mikhail Shipkin, Shipkin, also Ukrainian, were among his correspondents. Quote, "I bow lowly to my countryman Petrov," wrote Shipkin in an 1832 letter full of Russian names not identified as Zemlyaki. 40 years later, Modest Mussorgsky dedicated several works on Ukrainian themes to Petrov. These included the Trepek from Piesni Pляски Смерти, as well as Sorochintsy Fair, an opera conceived as a vehicle for Petrov, and based on a story, of course, by Gogol. For years, Mussorgsky delayed the opera, despairing of his ability to capture Ukrainian speech accents in music, and he left Sorochintsy Fair unfinished after Osip Petrov's death in 1878. Clearly, Petrov's Ukrainian roots were not irrelevant or inaudible to his contemporaries. There's even an intriguing hint in a 1950 biography by Lastochkina that Petrov's remarkable Russian diction was the result of very careful study. She writes that once in Petersburg, Petrov worked with the actor and pedagogue Yakov Bryonsky to reduce his Ukrainian accent. I'm not sure where she got that detail from, so let's consider it unverified for now. Perhaps then, there is another way of understanding the differences critics saw between the performing styles of Petrov, trained on the job in Ukrainian provincial theater troupes, and Vorobyova, trained formally at the Imperial Theater School in St. Petersburg. Juliet Forshaw calls both Petrov and Vorobyova Italian-trained, referring to the fact that the two singers both took voice lessons from Caterino Cavos in St. Petersburg in the 1830s. But Petrov's initial training took place far from Petersburg, and he was not the only theatrical performer to come from this specific climate and be hailed as an era-defining champion of dramatic realism upon arriving in the capital. Another such performer was Shchepkin, and here he is again. In Ukraine, Mikhail Shchepkin and Osip Petrov had both been members of a traveling theater troupe led by the same impresario, Shine, though I don't think they overlapped. They certainly did meet in 1828 in Poltava, where they acted alongside each other for some time. Osip Petrov's Soviet biographer, Lvov, calls this experience formative for the future opera singer. He writes that Petrov modeled his own dramatic methods on Shchepkin's approach to creating truth on stage. I suspect that Lvov may be overstating the closeness of Petrov and Shchepkin's relationship. Shchepkin, 17 years Petrov's senior, was already a star at this point, and their acquaintance in Poltava was of uncertain and probably brief duration. That does not preclude conscious modeling. It isn't far-fetched to think that a young actor might be influenced by an older and more famous one. But I think we need to look beyond personal relationships and consider the ecosystem in which Petrov, like Shchepkin, spent the early part of his career. What realist cocktail, I'm tempted to ask, was spiking the water in 1820s Poltava? The theatrical climate of early 19th century Ukraine differed in some fairly fundamental ways from that of contemporary Moscow and Petersburg. In 1756, Catherine the Great had established the Imperial Theater's Directorate to regulate dramatic productions in St. Petersburg. For most of the 19th century, the state-supported directorate held a monopoly, first de facto and then from 1826 to 1822 official, on theatrical performances in both of Russia's capital cities. The theaters overseen by the directorate were, quote, elegant palaces of high culture, in the words of theater historian Mihail Fowler. Here they are. And the repertoire, classical, aristocratic, politically unadventurous, matched the buildings. But the state-sponsored Imperial Theater's Directorate had no jurisdiction outside of Moscow and Petersburg. Repertoire performed at provincial theaters was motley. It mixed media, words and music, genre, comedy, tragedy, vaudeville, farce, and tone, highbrow and lowbrow, sometimes extremely lowbrow. At the edges of the empire, where Russian was not the first or only language of theater-goers, dramatic repertoire often mixed languages as well. That was nowhere more true than in multi-ethnic and multilingual Ukraine, with its sizable Jewish, Polish, Russian, and ethnically Ukrainian population. Center versus periphery was not just a geographical distinction, it was also an artistic one. The details of Osip Petrov's tenure as a professional actor in early 19th century Ukraine are sketchy at best, and research into them is challenging in our current geopolitical moment. At present, I have a number of tantalizing questions and few answers. We can begin to fill in some of the gaps, however, with the help of Shipkin's better documented biography, along with more general primary and secondary sources related to the cultural history of Ukraine at this time. One thing we can be sure of is that Osip Petrov did not work exclusively as an opera singer on provincial stages between 1826 and 1830, at least as we might normally understand that term. He did sing, and sometimes in operas, but this was expected of everyone who performed in troupes such as Stein's, regardless of musical training or even musical talent. Shepkin recalled and complained that his managers in Moscow were still asking him to perform in operas by the likes of Cherubini, as he had done in the provincial theaters, despite his own assessment that he had a terrible voice. The repertoire Petrov performed as a journeyman actor would have run the gamut from spoken theater to vaudeville and singspiel to opera, and he would have been expected to move among these styles quickly and effortlessly. That ability to switch hit served him well when he moved to Petersburg in 1830. At least throughout the 1830s and possibly well after that, the Russian opera troupe's leading bass was performing in the imperial theaters in plays that had no music at all. For example, in 1834, Petrov created the role of Zarutsky, notably a Ukrainian Cossack character, in Nestor Kukelnik's play The Hand of the Almighty Saves the Fatherland. Here is the original cast list. The author, by the way, Kukelnik, was a friend of Glinka's who contributed some words to the libretto of A Life for the Tsar. These activities put Petrov in very close working contact with St. Petersburg's leading actors, not Shepkin because he was in Moscow, but Sosnitsky, Karatilin, and Martynov at precisely the time when onstage realism was the most urgent topic in the theatrical world. Kukelnik's The Hand of the Almighty Save the Fatherland was paradigmatic fare for the imperial theaters. It was a lofty five-act play written in verse, and like A Life for the Tsar, which premiered 2 years later, it trumpeted the imperial ideals of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. The work in which Osip Petrov had made his stage debut years earlier as a member of Zhudakovsky's troupe in Yelizavetgrad was much less elevated, but it was not dissimilar in political outlook. Petrov's first professional performance was in a Russian language vaudeville called The Cossack Poet, which was written by Alexander Shakhovskoy, who headed the imperial theaters from 1802 to 1826, with music by Katerina Kavos. Scholars of Ukrainian literature often depict The Cossack Poet as, quote, a great Russian attempt to represent little Russian life, or as the center's attempt to speak for the periphery. But in the provincial theaters of Ukraine, that centralizing imperial voice conversed with many others, and Petrov's most successful role in his early career was in a play with a very different perspective. That work was Natalka Poltavka, a play influenced by contemporary sentimentalist literature. Like The Cossack Poet, Natalka Poltavka is a comic vaudeville or musical play, though its author called it an opera. It was written by Ivan Kotlяревsky, a native of Poltava, often lionized as the father of Ukrainian literature. Natalka Poltavka was one of 2 Ukrainian language plays Kotlяревsky wrote as the artistic director of the Poltava Free Theater, which was established in 1817 and staffed with actors from Stein's theatrical troupe, including Mikhail Shipkin. According to George Grabowitz, a scholar of 19th century Ukrainian literature, Natalka Poltavka represented a creative engagement with the Cossack poets, one that is often regarded, simplistically, Grabowitz writes, as a nationalist polemical answer to Shakhovskoy's imperial voice. Grabowitz writes, quote, Kotlяревsky hoses off the dross from Kazakh stихотворец to arrive at the plot of Natalka Poltavka. All the agitprop stuff, the fawning loyalism, and the Tsarist triumphalism is dropped. In fact, the entire Russian-Ukrainian connection with its undercurrent of conflict and Ukrainian treachery, which forms the core of Shakhovskoy's vaudeville, is removed. Elements of response to and critique of Kazakh stихотворец are obvious and textually stressed. Natalka Poltavka was wildly popular among Ukrainian audiences who hailed it, in contrast to the Cossack poet, for its socially typical treatment of local characters and its fine-grained depiction of Ukrainian folk life. In the intervening years, Kotlяревsky's plays have often been read in terms of resistance to imperial assimilation, as a Ukrainian author's assertion of his literary right to speak for Ukraine in Ukrainian and in conversation, not unison, with St. Petersburg. Not for nothing did these plays premiere in Poltava, a city best known for an act of anti-Russian resistance. Osip Petrov became locally renowned for playing the role in Natalka Poltavka that Kotlяревsky had written for Shevkin, the petty town official Wyborny. This is not the role with the most singing, by the way. A half-sympathetic, half-villainous, largely ridiculous toady, Wyborny is a comic bungler with some pathos. And while idiomatic Ukrainian speech is a fundamental part of Natalka Poltavka's premise, Petrov and Shevkin's role offers special challenges in this regard. As Grabowitz notes, the role of Wyborny mixes a number of different sociolects: vernacular Ukrainian, official Russian, and a kind of bureaucratese familiar to those who have read Gogol. To this mix, Wyborny adds distinct patterns of his own: a penchant for repeating the same thoughts in different terms, and a habit of tripping over his own words. The role of Wyborny in Natalka Poltavka, then, required an actor capable of range and nuance, who could express a number of conflicting personality traits and blend comedy with pathos, and who could convey all of that through highly distinctive yet socially characteristic speech. You are, I'm sure, anticipating my conclusion that the elements for which Petrov was known early in his career, sensitive declamation, a blend of comedy and pathos, a mastery of many different types of roles, nuanced yet socially typical characterization, would become leitmotifs of his later reception after his transition from Ukrainian actor to Russian singer. Mutatis mutandis, many of these things are also key ingredients in our understanding of Russian musical realism writ large. There is some irony in the fact that Russia has always imagined its own classical music tradition as peripheral to a Western center, and Russian composers' realistic gestures are often explained as a kind of underdog's revenge, as attempts to break away from the conventions of Italian opera, which enjoyed, as the Russian opera did not, the largesse of the Tsar's purse. But Osip Petrov, who premiered nearly all Russian operas written during the so-called Age of Realism, had honed his talents in the provincial theaters of colonial Ukraine, where Russian drama, not Italian opera, was the hegemonic art form to be reckoned with. The question of how Ukrainian provincial theater might relate to Russian musical realism, as embodied in the operatic performances of Osip Petrov, may seem obtuse. After all, it hangs on two entities that have scarcely figured in traditional narratives about Russian opera, Ukraine on the one hand, and performers on the other. But probing into Petrov's background and training in 1820s Ukraine can help us connect the history of Russian opera with the history of Russian theater, an unimaginably rich relationship that remains largely unexplored. Such a perspective can help us understand realism as something embodied, something mediated or even created by performers who are not just vanishing vessels for some other author's intentions. Considering the case of Osip Petrov, the great Russian bass from Little Russia, can also help us begin to untangle some of the complexities surrounding national identity in the Russian Empire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that fascinating talk. Grace, we'll turn to you for your remarks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to serve as SOBESEDNIK. 19B is a new community for me, so please do not get any impression that I am a musicologist. But I do work on Ukraine and Russia and navigating national identities amid imperial contexts. And as it relates to media of literary commemorations, such as house museums and monuments. But nevertheless, I am grateful for the opportunity to engage your work, Emily, and thank you for sharing it with us. I certainly learned a lot about the art of opera and feel more prepared as an educated audience member next time I see one. In your talk, you point out Osip Petrov's non-Russian ethnicity, mixed ethnic and linguistic home city of Ukraine, and early work in Ukrainian theater as primers for Petrov's performance range and staying power in his career in the Russian Imperial Opera. I find these connections compelling, and not only do they contribute to an understudied field that examines the historical relationship between Russian opera and theater and Ukrainian theater, but also finds a place in the growing body of research on cultural figures with Ukrainian Russian, Russian Ukrainian identities such as Gogol and Malevich. So I just have 3 questions to kick off our discussion. So I'll just go through those here. We can see the relationship with Russian national mythology and folk heroes outlined in your analysis of A Life for the Tsar, and how these imperial and national narratives were positively received in Russian critical circles. I'd be interested to hear if you know that this opera was performed in the imperial provinces or outside the Russian Empire, and if you, especially with Petrov in this role, and if you have information on the critical reception among Ukrainians and Poles, either in those provincial spaces or including, performances in St. Petersburg or the imperial capitals. My second question is that you lay out the complexities of reading the relationship between Petrov's biographical persona and his onstage roles, and the governing tendencies and criticism and scholarly typologies to subliminate one to the other. You look at the emergence of realism as a frame for this, but I'd be interested to hear if you more deeply engage any conceptual work around persona, performance, or concepts from post-colonial studies, such as hybridity, to address the role of Ukrainian identity in all of this. And another concept I would throw in for your consideration would be adaptation theory. One substrate linking both the Russian opera and Ukrainian theater is adaptations from literary works, which it sounds like you have experience in from your dissertation work. Adaptations from literary works to the stage, and especially by canonical literary figures. And another connection would be this chameleon type of opera singer, which has a relationship with biological adaptation. So it could be useful to think of adaptation of text to stage alongside a figure like Petrov's linguistic, stylistic, and persona adaptations in this context. And if you have a reaction to that idea, I'd be interested. And then finally, your talk is framed in this moral call in the field of Russian studies to address imperialism and colonialism, especially in the context of Russia's neo-imperial ideologies and violences, namely Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that began in 2022. And I think you really succeed in identifying the national imperial myths and their making around concepts, cultural concepts of so-called like Russian genius, greatness, and artistic depth, and addressing these mixed and hybrid identities and imperial contexts, and those as being very dynamic, right, and informed by a lot of complicating factors. And I'd be interested, as I believe we move to a larger conversation or questions, to hear from the colleagues here how everyone is navigating this in their own work as an ongoing issue. I may also suggest that decolonizing Russian studies can manifest in even more subtle but still impactful ways. For example, when applicable, or referring to mixed identity groups, in the case of maybe an opera troupe as such, instead of only Russian, and dropping imperial monikers from figures like Catherine, referring to them instead of as the Great to Catherine II. So beyond my comment, a question would be, how has it been for you navigating this project with this, added layer of looking at the Ukrainian role in Petrov's work, and what sort of support or guidance would you seek from colleagues in this regard? Thank you.
Grace, thank you for those great questions. Emily, maybe you can just take a minute to address a few of those, and then we can open the floor to more questions. And thank you both.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Grace. I have so much to think about here. So to the question, was A Life for the Tsar performed outside of Moscow and Petersburg? This is one that didn't, I'm actually not sure whether it was performed in the provinces. I imagine, I mean, the vocal score definitely traveled. So you would have had people performing it in homes. That's how most operas were kind of heard for the first time in the provinces, because a lot of places didn't have the means to put on huge operatic productions. A Life for the Tsar generally hasn't traveled much outside of Russian-speaking lands. There are a couple of exceptions to this, but in general, Glinka is not somebody who travels very well, not somebody who Western audiences are particularly well acquainted with. But A Life for the Tsar was always performed in the 19th century whenever there was an uprising of Poles, or there's especially after the assassination attempt of the first one on Alexander II. Of course, the opera that had to be performed was A Life for the Tsar, because they thought that Karakozov, the assassin, the would-be assassin, might have been Polish. He wasn't. But they thought that. In any case, so Poles still find this opera very offensive, and in part for Glinka's stereotypical and frankly derogatory treatment of them. Hybridity, persona theory, and adaptation theory are really, as I sort of massage this into the book length version of this, the chapter length version of this talk. Those are certainly areas I want to deal with. I'm fascinated, especially the hybridity connection with Gogol and other figures like that. But also adaptation theory. So in my field, in Russian music studies, we normally look at just adaptations between literature and opera, right? And that's almost the only way that we study adaptation. And I think the stage, or the context of performance, provides such an interesting kind of third point of the triangle, because this is the way in which people, for the most part, who were going to operas this is the medium through which that adaptation would have been received, right? And there's a form of adaptation too that happens when actors decide how they're going to take these words and these notes and interpret them on stage. And I just have always found that so fascinating, especially because when we see critics use terms like realism or life or truth, often, even more often, they are attached to performance styles rather than to what composers actually did. So it's a really crucial part of the puzzle, I think. How are we dealing with decolonizing Russian studies? I find myself really a neophyte in this space where I'm really thinking about Ukraine, and the ways and all of these complexities that I've tried to start to sketch out here. But I'm very, very grateful to you for pointing out some of those places where I lapsed in doing so, Catherine the Great, for example. And I look forward to this conversation up there too.
Thank you so much again, Emily, for this fascinating talk, and thank you, Grace, for your comments. I'll give people a minute to think, and I'll look for hands for questions and comments. I know I have some of my own, but Sarah Dickinson.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and it's been years since I've heard a talk on Russian music, so I'm a little out of my element here. But you brought up so many things, and the interesting overlaps with literature, like this figure Shepkin, who he's always showing up in somebody's letters or travel notes, and I think he was best friends with, or a good friend of many writers, and traveled with them and so on. But I also had a question. I mean, if you could say more about him, that would be fantastic. I also had a question about, I've been looking a little bit at Shakovskoy, and I think he had a property in the 1830s where he moved to the Kharkiv area. And since you talked a lot about Poltava, I was wondering if do you know anything about theater in Kharkiv and how it might have compared, or did they have opera there, or just random questions.
So in Kharkiv, they would have had traveling groups that came around, and one of the impresarios, and actually it's the impresario that or one of the impresarios that Shipkin worked with, was based in Kharkiv. That's Stein. So these many of these smaller cities, it's not even necessarily a smaller cities, but many of these cities didn't have you know, a dedicated opera theater in particular, a dedicated theater, but they would have had traveling troops that would have performed in various kinds of spaces at that moment. So I would imagine that would have been the situation in Kharkiv. Theaters did start to be built also, but I'm not exactly sure about the specifics of Kharkiv's scene in particular.
Mhm. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Well, while we're looking for their hands, I have a question myself, and this is a question that comes out of my own ignorance, quite obviously, and it's a big, vague one. And that is, can you just provide a little bit of information on what realism means when it's referring to opera? And whether because I'm thinking about it for my purposes, are there any overlaps with the way that we speak about literary realism? I tend to think probably not, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, this is a great question and a big one. I think the most common way in which people can point to realism in opera is to look at Mussorgsky, and in particular his attempt to capture the rhythms and intonations of Russian speech in music. This was something that was very controversial at the time. Conservative critics like Laroche were always saying, kind of, "Where's the melody? This is ugly. This is not how we should sing." The attempts to do away with those kinds of forms that of Italian opera, the double aria form, the Code Rossini, is considered a realistic gesture. But I think, to be honest, that this is kind of an impoverished idea of realism that we located only in these kinds of quite obvious musical devices, because I think that there were more subtle ways in which composers engaged with their literary contemporaries. Tchaikovsky, for example, is typically thought of as not a realist. When Yevgeny Onegin, his opera was kind of when French audiences got a load of it in the 1890s, when they got a load of it in Nice, they considered it the most up-to-date, realistic opera that had ever been written. Partly because it begins not with, you know, a huge opening chorus, but with, you know, Madame Lorina sitting there with the nurse making jam, you know, with this very real, and there's the sound of domestic performance happening in the background. And also with many composers, Tchaikovsky is one, but Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, you get this kind of attempt to represent consciousness in a continuous way. So kind of what we associate with Tolstoy, what Chernyshevsky says about Tolstoy, that other authors represent kind of the beginning and the end of a conscious process, right? One emotional state and then another. Tolstoy fills in the middle. I see Russian composers attempting to do that too. And I would argue that actually this aria that I just showed you of the forest scene is an attempt to do that, at least the Shana part of it, because we get a ramble. We get, you know, Petrov is thinking about Antonita, then he's thinking about this, then that, present and past, all these different. So it's a process that's being foregrounded here rather than just one emotional state than another. So to me, that is also realism. And so this idea of realism is just about avoiding musical conventions. Well, I don't quite buy that, in part because conventions can be realistic, right? I mean, we all speak in conventional ways. That's another thing. So I think it's a bit of a simplistic understanding of realism when we confine it just to those quite obvious gestures.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. And I mean, probably what a formalist would say on the literary side is that one of the ways you make the claim that you're being realistic is you say you're not doing whatever people used to do formally, right? So you're just rejecting whatever the previous generation did, and you're saying that was sort of formulaic and not realism. Now I'm doing realism because I'm not doing that. So sorry, I'll go to Piotr's question in a minute, but just to make one quick follow-up question. So the word realism in opera is associated with a kind of современность, right? There's something more modern about it, but it's not particularly ideological, right? Because like in realist prose, it's ideological, it's social criticism, but not in opera, right?
Yeah, that is a difference. I think in general, Russian composers were a lot less um, ambitious, I guess, in than their literary contemporaries in thinking that, you know, my works can have a real political impact. Certain of them were. I mean, one of the scenes that is pointed to as a kind of huge realist monument is a scene of like revolt, or two scenes of revolt, actually. One in Boris-Godunov, where we have the people uprising, shown in kind of open revolt against the boyars. And one is in Pskovitz-Yanka, where we also have a kind of popular revolt. So we do have a bit of that, a bit of kind of social criticism, but composers in general were less politically inclined, or at least less inclined to directly write their politics into their operas. Part of
Makes
it,
sense because the opera needs state support, right? It needs all this
yeah,
infrastructure.
and
It's
there were all sorts of restrictions on live performance, right? So like you couldn't show a Tsar on stage, a Roman of Tsar on stage. Um, So you couldn't make direct social criticism, but which is why you have, which is why, incidentally, you have so many operas written during the Age of Realism that take place during the time of troubles, because it's the latest period that you could write about without having a Romanov Tsar. Um, so, yeah, that's their attempt to be critical, but as modern as possible.
Piotr Oxer.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. And um, my question, and also to follow up with what Anne was saying, it's interesting that Osip Petrov, being the son of merchants, kupцы, nevertheless had an upbringing as an artist, was educated and seemed to be prepared for the life of an artist. And this was something that you mentioned in terms of the writing, that, you know, is describing his childhood. And I'm curious to me what he would have thought of that, given his parents' life, and you know what he would have thought knowing his ancestors, and whether they were artists and things like this. That division between the previous generation and then perhaps the generation before, and why there would be a discontinuity. I don't know how long his family, for example, was in
Elizabeth, yeah.
or where he was. At any rate, he's he's also someone who I was curious about in terms of the Natalia Poltavka performance. What was that actress's later life, after, you know, the period that seems that she was involved with Petrov, and, you know, as you were saying, as a performer who was a part of her life, perhaps at different times and in different cities. What was the next stage of their life after that particular performance, that was also repeated? I don't know if that was a convention of the time. I have family in theater. My grandfather performed or directed Arturo Ui several times, but that also goes back to a 19th century tradition, and somebody that he knew that you know was also representing in different ways, different performances in different cities of that particular production by Brecht.
Let's already respond because I know we're gonna run out of time soon. But thank you very much, Piotr.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so Petrov's family were merchants. He wasn't trained as an artist from a young age. He was working in his uncle's tavern, actually, and and just a traveling theater troupe came to town, and he said, "Hey, that seems fun. Can I join you?" And this was, you know, when the actors came into the tavern, he asked and just sort of joined up. And so he was not trained in that sense that he had, you know, a sort of education in acting. He learned on the job, you know, it was sort of an apprenticeship rather than a kind of formalized, institutionalized training. Um, so sorry, I forgot the second question. Oh, about Anna Vorobyova, her life after she retired from the stage. So they remained married their entire life, for the rest of Petrov's life. And they held a kind of salon sometimes, and were frequent guests in salons in St. Petersburg with folks like Mussorgsky and Rimsky-Korsakov. And actually, the opera of Mussorgsky's that he wanted to write for Petrov, Sorochintsy Fair, was actually, he wanted to write it for both of them, Petrov and Vorobyova, and they would play a kind of Ukrainian couple in this work.
Thank you. That's very interesting. That is interesting. Yeah.
And you're muted.
I'm sorry about that. I just said I'm waiting for other hands. We are coming to the end of our time, but we might have another question or two. Oh, Sarah, please.
There we go. Yeah, I have a question. When you showed the repertoire of his performances, I was really struck by how Russian everything is. Were Russian opera houses performing European operas, or did they just have guest performers doing those operas, and they did all of their own nationally inspired productions?
So actually, the big theaters in Russia, especially until the late 1860s, were mainly performing Italian operas and French grand operas.
With Russian singers, with a Russian cast?
Sometimes. So Petrov's, so the Russian singers were kind of employees of the Imperial Theater Directorate, so they could be compelled to perform wherever the directorate wanted them to. But Russia, so the various stars were also bringing in usually kind of washed up Italian opera singers into the capitals to perform there. And bankrolling the Italian opera troops with with this huge these lavish productions, costumes and sets that the Russian troupe could only dream of. And this is where a lot of the sort of animosity to Italian opera comes from, this sense of real sour grapes that the Italian troupe is getting all this money, and the Russian troupe, and in this case, they're called the Russian troupe because they perform Russian language operas. The Russian troupe didn't get, state subsidy until later, and so there were operas in many different languages happening. There was Der Freischütz was performed in German. You would have had French Grand Opera. Meyerbeer was the most popular composer in all of Europe in the 1830s and 40s. So you would have had a lot of that going on. Russian opera in Russian was only a small part of the sort of operatic life of Petersburg and Moscow.
Oh, okay. Because his performances look like a kind of a handbook for Russian nationalist music.
Yeah, and it's almost every single opera. He's in there, and he's a big part of it, and it's interesting in literature on Russian opera. Petrov is usually treated almost dismissively, right? I think that the fact that his voice may not have been spectacular, right? But he had other qualities that were maybe superseded his musical abilities. So he's often treated very very dismissively, even by people like Stasov, who calls him at one point one of the founders of the Russian operatic tradition. When Mussorgsky starts writing Sorochintsy Fair, Stasov says, why is he like busying himself with this little Russian nonsense when it's just because of the Petrovs, why is he doing this? This isn't what he should be up to. So there's a bit of that as well.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Well, this has been really interesting. I've learned a huge amount, and it's definitely left me with so much to think about. So I want to thank you, Emily, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you, Grace, for your remarks, and thank you, everybody, for coming. And I hope that we can keep going with the interdisciplinary dialogue. We'll see you next month.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Bye.